door-to-door in Regina and Saskatoon.
Okay.
Richard,
go ahead.
I think what became the issue was the suggestion thrown in again about the corruption of children, pedophilia. It was not the centerpiece of it, and ultimately I think the Court of Appeal overturned the decision in this particular case on the basis that this was not a central piece of this. There was an ongoing debate about all of that. Now, this is a large question, and I should have written down all the different dimensions to it. I will go in two directions here. I actually wrote a report in which I recommended the Canadian Human Rights Commission the Canadian Human Rights legislation no longer deal with hate speech. I didn't think it's the appropriate mechanism to deal with it for a variety of reasons, which I won't get into here. With that said, I think if you actually look at the case law in most of these situations, we're talking about pretty extreme expression where it's ultimately found to breach these codes. That in fact, the language is quite broad and sweeping. And the Supreme Court of Canada in a case called Taylor really led the way to say, look, we really are talking about extreme expression here. Whatever it might say, it's got to be extreme in character. Now, with that said, I think there are a whole range of reasons why this is not the appropriate process to deal with it, because I think ultimately human rights commissions are concerned with discrimination, broadly understood, and there is some risk of understanding the speech that should be restricted in a very broad fashion.
Janet.
The Alberta Human Rights Act has a section that's very similar. It's not identical to what you just read out. I think it's from what you read out or quoted from Saskatchewan's, it's identical, but for the word ridicule. It's illegal to say anything, publish whatever, that would tend to expose a group or an individual to hatred or contempt. And I can say in the Lund and Boisson case, which has agonized us in Alberta for quite a few years, and I think is on appeal to the Alberta Court of Appeal, that legislation was handled extremely badly by the first decision by the Human Rights Panel. So at the Human Rights Commission level, the reasoning was atrocious. This concerned a letter to the editor, to the Red Deer Advocate. And I first read the decision of the Human Rights Panel and then read the letter, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I couldn't believe that the analysis actually applied to that. So I think we've got a real problem with laws that go to the substance of communication, and if you're going to have people deliberate on that, you want real judges in the best circumstances. You don't get a lot of the bad stuff you get at the human rights level. And I'm a supporter of Alberta, of human rights commissions in general for discrimination.
Richard, brief comeback, and then we'll get this
I
gentleman.
was just going to say, just not that this changes all the concerns we might share about the commission process as a way of dealing with hate speech, but the Alberta Queen's Bench overturned the decision.
Yeah, absolutely, it did, but that was
This gentleman right here, please.
What troubles me about the hate speech laws is their uneven applicability. To give an example, if one were denied the Jewish Holocaust, that would be considered hate speech. But if one denies, say, the lesser genocide of the Armenian genocide by the Turks, it doesn't seem to have the same, it's not given the same import. And I was wondering if you would like to comment on that.
And who wants in on that?
Well,
Go ahead,
it's not. I don't know whether it's completely clear cut whether, denial of what we might hopefully regard to be historical occurrence, whether that would itself count as hate speech. What's complicated is whenever Holocaust denial occurs, it's always embedded in the context of, well, and of course this is part of the Jewish conspiracy of some kind. There's always something more to it in some way that, gives it a different sort of character. Now, Holocaust denial has not been a large issue, at least in the courts here or before human rights commissions. In Europe, it has been. But there may be a whole other set of reasons why Germany feels it ought today to have a Holocaust denial law. Without getting into that, one can understand there might be a particular sense of responsibility and obligation in that particular context.
Okay, this lady here, please. You mind standing so they can see you? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Mel Harris, and I'm from Alberta, and I'm sort of taking a huge nosedive here. I work a lot with children and intellectual freedom with children, and I'm really concerned about this bill in Alberta at the moment where parents can choose to pull their children out of class. I'm working with a kindergarten teacher at the moment to bring books in to show the children in the class the different families that are in their class, and they're incredible. It's two same-sex, divorced, different, and I've been told I can't do that. So this is what worries me. If we are where we are as adults today, why are we not starting the conversation with children without our baggage? Why are we not letting them see that these are families that are in their school, and that they're normal families? And I think that's somewhere where we have to start and we have to fight, is not bringing our little ones up to feel the way a lot of us feel.
Janet, go ahead.
There are just a few of us Albertans in the room, and we bear the burden of this terrible legislation. Fortunately, the rest of the country doesn't have the same thing, but you point to an extraordinary problem, and it is a problem of limitation on speech. I mean, here's another example. This legislation is in our Human Rights Act, and it gives parents or guardians the right to advance notice. So the responsibility is on the schools to give parents or guardians advance notice when instruction will go to religion, sexual orientation, and human sexuality. So school has to give advance notice to that. So you just think about what that does to the discussion of spontaneous things that students would just bring into the classroom. But here's an example that was given by an Aboriginal person who was very much opposed to this legislation, and she said she gets called in when bullying goes on in schoolyards when, say, Aboriginal kids are involved. She gave an example. A kid with braids is being bullied in the schoolyard, and she ordinarily, before this legislation, would be immediately brought in to explain the spirituality. Why does this kid wear braids, and why is it so significant to him and his family? And this legislation impedes that. And as she says, if we go through the whole bureaucratic thing about sending home notice and somewhere down the road we're going to talk about it, the teachable moment has passed, actually. So it does have to do with hate speech, because it's motivated by a tremendous intolerance. It was motivated mostly by intolerance towards gays, and in fact, it's a matter of fact, that intolerance was generated from a religious perspective.
And this is and for me, this is a very vexing thing for me as somebody who's a lesbian mother, and and has been like for a long time, because, and I don't even, I can only say this, that I fear that we are on a collision course, and that I'm not even sure how it's going to be resolved, about how we are going to reconcile the Canadian passion for multiculturalism and respect for people's everything, and especially as regards homophobia within religions, mostly fundamentalist versions of those religions, I just want to clarify. And it's a very distressing thing for me, because I don't think we're going to be shiny, happy people all together. I think we really are on a collision course,
Like in
and
the
I'm not
past.
sure how it's going to resolve.
Janet, quick comeback, Janet?
Yeah, and no, it's not a comeback. It's supplementary too.
Quick
And
supplement, Janet?
That is, I think that there's a really important conversation. It's a different one than the one we're having primarily tonight, about what it means to embrace diversity, which I'm all for. Until the embrace of diversity, until you're embracing a kind of difference that drags us back from our human rights.
Yeah, but the funny thing about this is that in instances in BC and Alberta and Ontario, right here in the city of Toronto, where religious fundamentalists across race, culture, and ethnicity have gotten together to push back against any kind of progressive representation of gay, lesbian, trans people in the education system. That's not about multiculturalism. That's about the fundamental problem of religion. And so, as an atheist, for me, all religions pose a problem to the free, democratic public sphere, right?
I would say fundamentalist versions
Yeah,
of
let's-
those. I'll just say fundamentalist.
Rinaldo, I'm learning more and more about you all the time. I knew you were black, I knew you were gay, now I know you're an atheist as well.
One could simply say this is a form of discrimination, sexual orientation discrimination. We should call it what it is, and I think that may be helpful.
Okay, you know what, let's do, because I think I sense in the room a desire to have more informal get-togethers, and let's save some time for that. So we'll do one more question here, and then we're going to have Bruce Walsh come up and talk to us about Penn for a couple of minutes, and then we'll just gather and talk amongst ourselves. Okay.
My name is Ayub Nouri, and I am a journalist from Iraq and fairly new to Canada. And when I listen to this panel, I can't help notice how big the differences are. The difference is between the concerns of free speech and hate speech in Canada and to another country, and how one point or rule applies to one place and not to another. But I believe, I was in Iraq when the cartoons of Prophet Muhammad were published, and I am a Muslim from a conservative town, conservative family, and the Middle East generally is conservative. But despite all that, I believe that the cartoons had to be published everywhere in the world. When it comes to free speech, I think there are things that should not be forgotten or forgiven. They should have been published anywhere. And also, it's very tricky to keep a balance between free speech and hate speech, because Iraq has never had a history of free speech. But in 2003, when the regime of Saddam Hussein was toppled, overnight people were free to say whatever they want and to publish whatever they want. And many people, extremist groups or insurgents or many others with historic feuds, took advantage of this free speech and started publishing whatever they wanted. And among the tens of thousands of people who were killed in Iraq, I'm sure a great number of them were killed because of things that were published or said about them. So I believe free speech, personally, should not be about offending this person or that person. Because when you prevent someone from saying something because it's hate speech, he will be offended. And when you let him say what he wants to say, another group will be offended. No matter what you do, because it's a very tricky situation, somebody will be offended. I think freedom of speech is very important, but so my last point is that it should not be about who is going to be offended. It should be about the consequences of that. If there is going to be violence, if there is going to be direct attack on that person's safety, I think that should be the matter. And in Canada, I find it amazing that somebody is prevented from saying something in Saskatchewan or Regina or somewhere because a gay person or a religious person is offended. Let him be offended, because when you don't let that person say what he wants to say, he will be offended. What will he do in this situation? Is he not a human being? I think freedom of speech or hate speech should be about the consequences. If it's going to be catastrophic, like it's happening in the Middle East, it should be prevented at any cost. If it's about offending people, let some people be offended for the sake of free speech. Thank you.
Interesting. How long have you been in Canada?
1 year.
You've been in Canada 1 year, and you got the biggest applause tonight. What do you think of that? Good job. Good job. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Anybody want to weigh in on that?
Without repeating everything we've
That's a
said.
good,
Yeah.
that's a,
He really summed it up quite beautifully, didn't he?
Well,
no, it's
I'm-
complicated. It's
I'm-
complicated.
Again, I guess to stress that it's not about the question of offense, but it's about the historical relationship that we see between the ways in which language is often works to put into place the conditions through which we can dehumanize other people. So, all this week, Muammar Gaddafi has been referring to the resistance as cockroaches. It's a deployment of language that then makes it possible to shoot people down, to maybe unleash chemical weapons on them. There's a relationship between language and action. There's a relationship between language and dehumanization, into which the clumsy way in which we deal with it as human beings in contemporary democratic societies is to have something called hate speech laws. Now, obviously, they don't work well, and we stumble around them, but they're an attempt to grapple with the terrible histories that human beings have created for each other that is often, not only, but often begins in language.